of cyber peace and cyber war. And probably the right person just walked in during the last panel when who knows the genesis of this. So this was in 2014 when there was a certain government official was getting a certain honor and was talking about cybersecurity in general. Everything was about cyber threat and it was so negative. So we started Cyber Peace Initiative, and that led to Cyber Future Foundation. And so the genesis of Cyber Future Foundation is actually Cyber Peace Initiative, and it couldn't be a better panel than this makes. So when I went to introduce the panel, they were introducing me to each other. So that was a fantastic way of knowing each other from how you say. So with this, I would like to welcome the panelists for the next panel. So we had a certain predetermined order to create a little bit of distortion. So I'll welcome Chad Sweet, and we'll go. Chad just made it. Just great. Okay. Yes, please. And Siobhan McDermott, Jack Tarian, and Rod Beckstrom. We'll have to flip a coin and see who goes last, because this is a pretty interesting one this way. We'll go in a certain order. For a change, I'll take the moderator, steal this seat from someone else, I thought, but I think this topic is so important now and so relevant today, right? January 3rd, we had an incident and then led to another one, and then hopefully we are getting some stability back in this planet. But where do we start from? So how about we do a quick round of introduction, and we go this way and we'll start the other way. Okay, Jacques, so yeah, you're going to introduce yourself?
Okay, it's on. Good afternoon, Colonel Yakhtarian, Director of NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. I've had the privilege now for about a year and a half to lead a 62 and growing team of exceptionally smart people. Since I've had interesting media encounters, sometimes I need to throw a disclaimer in that NATO CCD COE, while bearing the name NATO, is not in NATO chain of command, nor does get NATO funding, so anything I say is not attributable to NATO and does not reflect NATO official views and policy.
And will self-destruct in 30 seconds.
All right, Rod, how about you?
I'm Rod Beckstrom. Spent most of my life starting up technology companies in Silicon Valley. The one I started in grad school, we took public, wrote a book the Director of National Intelligence liked, and so he recruited me to be a senior advisor, and I was one of the two authors of the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative for the US government. And then he and President Bush asked me to stand up the National Cybersecurity Center, which was a JV where I had coordinating authority over the NSA Center, DoD centers, FBI Center, DHS Center, and others, and had the great pleasure of working with Chad Sweet, who was Chief of Staff for Chertoff, Secretary Chertoff. Did that, and I've managed two of the largest cyber crises in the world. The only threat on bringing the entire global internet down was in 2012, Operation Global Blackout. I was CEO of ICANN at the time, the Global Internet Domain Name Coordination Body that was directly under attack, so I had legal responsibility for coordinating the global response with several hundred corporations and governments, and I was part of protecting one of the largest financial institutions in the world that had one of, if not the largest, financial hacking event. I was the top advisor to the chairman and CEO before that event happened. So anyway, been knocking around in space, but my life calling is to serve peace, so I'm really excited about the conversation.
All right, great. Take care, Siobhan.
Hi, I'm Siobhan McDermott. I'm Vice Chair for Bank of America's Global Corporate Investment Bank. You might ask yourself why I'm here. I spent every second of my career before doing that in cybersecurity, both in Silicon Valley, several startups and working in that space, and then most recently served as the co-president of the FSR, the Financial Systemic Analysis and Resiliency Center that we stood up in the United States. Don't say that 5 times fast. And I also was the head of Global Cyber Public Policy for Bank of America.
Thanks. I'm Chad Sweet, the co-founder of the Chertoff Group. I was the former Chief of Staff at Homeland Security under Secretary Michael Chertoff, and prior to that was also in the CIA. I had the privilege of working with Rod. Siobhan and I had also been together on the RAND Global Center for Risk and Security. And then when we were in office, as Rod said, we helped start the first comprehensive national cybersecurity initiative with Rod and the team. In addition, we've worked with Siobhan and others on things like Quantum Dawn, some of the protocols and other types of U.S. national response we've had to grapple with. It's the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is how do you treat something like cyber in the context of war and peace. Last thing I'll say is I'm with the Chernoff Group, so we both advise on security and then we invest and transact in security. One area in particular is in cyber. So welcome any discussion on that after the panel as well.
Great, Chad. Maybe we just start from there. And though you three have worked with each other, I think talking to each of you had a very distinct point of view of where you looked at in your perspective of cyber war and cyber peace and how we distinguish. Also, how we can draw kind of more distinct lines between the two. So, Chad, a little bit of background of your perspective on cyber war and cyber peace.
I think it's, first of all, I commend the Cyber Future Forum and Val and David for all that you're doing to advance this topic, because I would argue that, as everyone on this panel will attest, it is really one of the greatest challenges of our time. And if we think back, the perspective I'd give is compare this to the nuclear age. And the nuclear is a horrible threat, and it's something that we all don't want to think about. And thank God we came up with war and peace norms. We had doctrines of deterrence that had clear attribution and stated doctrines of retribution. In order for deterrence to be effective, you need to have both attribution and a stated declared policy of retribution. The reason those came into being is because there's only one country on the face of the earth that's ever used nuclear weapons against another country, and especially on a civilian population, and that's my country, the United States of America, when we dropped 2 nuclear weapons, one on Hiroshima and the other on Nagasaki, and the intent was to end the war. It was a horrible decision that our president had to make, President Truman, but it did provoke a needed discussion around the world on what should the world do to establish norms on the use of this new technology. That problem was horrific and had huge consequences. What I would argue, though, is actually it's a simpler problem than cyber. Attribution, we have built a global sensor network where we can detect within seconds exactly where a nuclear plume originated and have attribution in a very defined way. There's also, for response, there's a hierarchy in the military where we have a very clear and incredible threat that if you do try to use these weapons, there will be a response. And as you can imagine, in the cyber realm, it's not hierarchical, it's not centralized, it's the exact opposite. It's decentralized, and it's, as many of the panelists before us said, even if you can get attribution, right now we lack a doctrine of retribution. So one of the things I hope we'll talk about today is, especially on the issue of accountability and retribution, how do we get that so we can prevent escalation, and then if we do get a conflict, how do we then de-escalate?
Right. Oh, I think transition to Siobhan and your point of view and I think when we talked about it, we had a distinct point of view of where we stand even with the cyber peace activities that are going on, right? Is that even happening at the pace and where we have stepped in and where we have stepped out, right? So the boundaries, so is your share of perspectives.
Yeah, I think, I agree with what Chad said, and I look at it from a slightly different perspective because we probably are operating in the most globally interconnected system on Earth in the financial sector. We don't have borders. So we are always dealing with the tension of national security versus being able to operate across borders and move money freely. And that represents maybe a different way of thinking about this, because I know the previous panel talked about, the notion of each country coming up with its own rules and regulations. That's not super helpful when you operate in almost all of those countries. It gives you a huge compliance burden and quite frankly, just the inability to keep up with everything that's changing. So when we think about, the notion of these activities that are coming around that are looking at building cyber peace initiatives or looking at, agreements that we won't attack in our industry, each other's financial networks in wartime and peacetime, these are really challenging because when you start to have those conversations at the G20 level or the G7 level even, There are, at the G20 level, nation states in the room. Right, so getting agreement when they're in the room is really tough. And even the agreement of certain countries that want the optionality to be able to use that leverage, should they need to, where they're not going to publicly sign up to it. So, I think there's steps that are being made in the right direction, but the challenge is how do you truly do this in a global manner?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's where the step ins and step outs has been when, do we publicly agree? And if one does not, then we don't have the international norm established, right, officially at least. So, right. So transitioning to Rod, when we talked about, you had a very long-term thinking in this area, like the anthropological, sociological aspect of this, right? So let's hear from you.
Thank you. Yeah, I like to do systems thinking, so I like to think about all aspects of a problem to really try to figure out how you can attack it and get traction. So I'm going to start off with a quote of a great German military philosopher, since we're in the German-speaking world, and that's Clausewitz, the Prussian strategist, who said that war is just politics by other means. And it's deeply insightful for cybersecurity. And I want to take it one step further, is that politics is really a reflection of society and sociology. And all of the social issues in any society that are unresolved, I argue, will first appear in the internet and in social media and in the cyber realm. Every unresolved issue, whether it's a minority issue, discrimination, a historic genocide, trauma that's occurred, everything that's bubbling up at some level. Even if you look at the battle between the nation states, the sociological issues. Russia senses the loss of its empire. USSR was a tremendously powerful nation and alliance, and that was lost, and Russia's still grappling with that. But so I want to talk about the sociological level for a second, and I'm going to link it to the present tense and make this extremely real, because there's challenges in the internet going on right now that are a result of the rise of populism in the world. And so in the United States, we've chosen to take a we move towards a populist administration with very strong sanctions and trade sanctions, which often go with that cycle through history all over the world. And in this case, what's happening is it's rippling into the internet architecture. There was already obviously a split between our approach in America, open internet, no website, domain name blocking, etc., and other countries like China choosing to do that. And I've worked with all nations closely, because when I ran ICANN works with every country in the world. So I work with telecoms and ministers and often heads of state all over the world. What is happening now is, for example, and I never would have thought the result of Huawei receiving sanctions is they got kicked out of the standards body. Now that's easy enough. No one anticipated that. I don't think it was a goal. It was bilateral result. But here's the result of that. As a result of that, the Chinese are now wondering, what if the President of the United States or someone else forced ICANN to take China out of the root of the internet? And ICANN could do that. ICANN could do that, and legally it could happen. I don't think it would ever happen in reality, but you've got different agendas. Russia has wanted to have a different governance structure than ICANN, has looked towards the ITU and other alternatives. Russia has announced they're already running their own new DNS in parallel, and China is trying to decide what to do. And I think they're actually in a difficult situation, because if you think from their position, they have to protect their national interest, and the risk of being taken out of the room is absolutely unacceptable. .cn being gone and .jongol being gone. And I don't think it's going to happen, and I'm one of the people that's directly involved in conversations to try to make sure these kind of things don't happen. But this is a result of sociology and the fact that it's a trend that happens. It's happening all over the world right now, and it's going to come to the internet. And it's already affecting the DNS. It could affect the DNS profoundly. I'm personally doing a lot of work to prevent a forking of the root. I helped prevent the fork globally in 2012 that came very close to occurring, extremely close. And in my role as ICANN, I was well positioned to work with China and the United States governments and Russians and others, and we avoided that. But I'm concerned now, and it's further complicated by the shift in core internet technology, namely SDN, or software-defined networks, which 5G is an expression of, and a lot of the internet traffic is going through IP, Internet Protocol, and DNS. Huge amounts are going through SDN inside the cloud, and that can go further to the endpoints that further complicates the picture. And without geeking out too much, what I want to get back is the main thesis that I have, which is that all unresolved sociological issues, anthropological issues, will get reflected in cyberspace. And so to get to peace, which we want to do, we've got to work on those issues and work on common and mutual understanding. And everyone here, I think, contributes to that. The financial services firms contribute to that. The ISACs do a great job. ICANN, WC3, and the conversations here at WEF. But that's the framework to which I'm looking at the global system and trying to think about how do we keep it working together as well as we can and lead to better outcomes as opposed to worse. Thank you.
So I think the overall sociological, anthropological issues can manifest in many ways. This is a way where you do not have the public face of it, so it's easier to manifest than when that taps into the inner human instinct collectively, right? So taking that on to the next level, and I think with all caveat of not representing NATO, but still CDCO is an important piece of this puzzle. What is your point of view in defining these two terms?
Right, thanks. I didn't have a starter joke this year, but this is the second year in a row I speak after Rod, and I accused him of stealing my notes last year. Read this. Karl von Clausewitz, war is continuation.
I told him I hacked into your computers.
I've never heard Clausewitz being quoted on a cyber conference before.
I mean, even on a piece of paper, Rod.
I know.
It's more effective with two of us, though. This is great.
Anyway, this is awesome. So we may think that we do our best effort on deciding the war or peace in cyber, but let's not forget that adversary has the final vote. Maybe not the final vote, but has a vote. So looking at the adversarial actors in cyberspace, or let's say state actors like we in the military tend to focus, all four that we can all name, Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia, have been very active in cyberspace. But let's take it a little more general. Let's take it to their doctrine, and Estonians tend to focus on Russia mostly. So the infamous Gerasimov article, which has been dubbed as Gerasimov Doctrine as well, 2013, the current Russian Chief of Staff, General Valery Gerasimov, published an article. All military people know it, but I'll sum it up in a brief way. It kind of stated how a modern war is being waged, and it was the beginnings of what we all know now as hybrid warfare. In essence, there wasn't that much news there, that the West had been talking about the instruments of power, the dying, the diplomatic, informational, military, economic, all the time. It's just how eloquently and how truly Gerasimov had put it together. But the most interesting thing to me there is the graph. So if you Google Gerasimov Doctrine, you get the English translation, look at the graphics there. There is a simple pictorial explanation of how war gets escalated, intensifies, and de-escalated. And we, the West, the democratic world, we have similar doctrinal graphs. It's just at the 0 point, we call it peace. In a Russian mindset, it wasn't called peace, it was potential for military conflict. It's a very, very subtle but drastic difference. Potential, so there is no such thing as peace. So if we think we are living in cyber peace, well, we are not. So there's been debates on what was the first Cyber Warfare Act. Estonians claim 2007 we were, victim of the state kind of politically motivated act. But we can go back further. Cyber espionage. Everybody thought the 90s were very peaceful. The Cold War had ended, the wall had gone down. Yeltsin was dancing drunk in public. It was all peace. In 1998, when I graduated from the US Air Force Academy, it became public that the Russians had been in Pentagon and other US military systems since 1996, as the investigation showed, what was called Operation Moonlight Maze. So 1996, probably most of us had computers, had email address. Who had an antivirus 1996 on their computer? I didn't. Some people, I'm sure, did, but I was going to say maybe 1/3, but probably even less. But cyber operations were going on, adversarial operations. What is NATO doing? I took too long for intro, I'll try to sum it up. Of course, NATO got into real action inspired by the 2007 Estonian case. So 2008, NATO declared first cyber policy. Couple more years, but in 2014 really, and mostly inspired by the issue of Tallinn Manual the year before 2013, NATO declared that Article 5 is also applicable in cyberspace. So an significant attack in cyberspace can warrant conventional or cyber collective response from NATO. And of course, the policy developed 2016. NATO declared cyberspace is a domain of operations where NATO must defend itself like it does in air, land and sea. Just a very logical definition that cyber is just a new domain, nothing new. And 2018, it was the declaration that NATO may use, or NATO will incorporate cyber effects, which is a fancy word for offensive cyber, into its operations, which are donated voluntary basis from the states, meaning NATO does not develop cyber weapons of its own, but since the states do it, they can voluntarily give it to NATO's use.
Let me ask you a follow-up question, and maybe they'll go backwards on this round. But when you say NATO looks for collective action and response, how is the boundaries determined? I mean, that's a big iffy part everywhere right now, right? I mean, how we heard from Pawan talking about Vietnam claiming to have a national sovereignty on cyberspace. So how do you determine boundaries?
You know, in my notes I said preempt a question, red line. What is the red line? But in a time short, it's because we get that often. So. Yeah. It's very deliberately defined vaguely, because NATO doesn't want to tempt an adversary to test the red line. So the definition is that significant economic damage and or human casualties.
Right, the indirect effect of a red line.
Yeah, if we would say, 5 million euros and 3 people dead, well, what if that attack results in 4 million and 2 people dead? What are we going to do? So it's very deliberately, loosely defined.
Okay. All right, Chan, let's go to you.
So one of the things we said is we wanted to hopefully have a lively discussion with some debate. So I'll start with commending NATO, because I do think we talked about what are the paradigms. NATO was a collective defense, and it was meant to create a deterrence. One of the criticisms, though, I want to commend both what you all did in the Wales Summit in declaring that not only is cyber a legitimate domain to respond to, but that Article 5 can be invoked. I think one of the biggest problems we've had, though, again, going back to this issue of attribution and retribution, is the first point that Job made, which is that it's not binary, it's not peace and war. There's a lot of gray in between in the hybrid space, especially in cyber. When I was in
You'd call it tension?
Say?
You'd call it tension?
Tension. And then the tension there is that, Microsoft did a really provocative framework where they said, look, you have criminal activity down here that can be handled by the laws of regular crime applied to cyberspace. Then you have more significant events that create disruptions all the way up to conflict, and then armed, actual all-out cyber war. In the highest level, the international law of war can, and it's still vague, but it can be applied. So I would disagree respectfully with Dr. Dougal, who was here before, that stated that there isn't international law today in cyber. I just respectfully disagree. In fact, I commend NATO because the Tallinn Manual process and the Wales Summit state explicitly that they're going to apply international law in cyber context and use that as the framework for what might trigger the declaration of Article 5. But to close this thought out, I'd love to hear what others think about this. The problem we have is that when it comes, we have had moments of attribution, as hard as attribution is. Let's take WannaCry. It took a long time, but we finally had a consensus. It was North Korea. You had a bad actor there who clearly, by any law of war, used a weapon that had significant disproportionate collateral damage to civilians and almost caused loss, as Denise said earlier, loss of life in the healthcare. People were on the operating table in the UK and hospitals closed down. If we couldn't actually get together and make an explicit retribution as an international community of interest against a bad act like that, against an actor like that, doing something so blatantly egregious and violating any international norm or standard, then we've failed to do our part on the retribution side. And so the only thing I want to push back on Jonathan is keeping this ambiguity and the vagueness of what's going to trigger retribution is actually doing a disservice, because it's not allowing criminals and other bad actors to know what's going to actually create a response. And the second thing is, some people, I'm not saying that I know anything classified, but there may have been some type of retribution against North Korea for WannaCry, but guess what? It's like a tree falling in the forest and nobody heard it. Yeah. So I have 2 daughters, and if my daughter, if I punish Abby in front of Chloe, the next time something happens, Chloe knows not to do that. So we need to start making our stated policy of retribution clear, and we need to make it public.
Yeah. I think the most clear probably is where Siobhan, you stand in financial services, right? I mean, you're in the middle of this, you're the instrument, you're also, a victim. So tell us a little bit about how you feel about, where to navigate between the two.
Well, like Chad, I also commend NATO for starting. I mean, the challenge is NATO doesn't represent every nation on earth, right? So it's just a start. And I think if we can't get, again, it has to go to every nation that has to sign up for it, to at least some kind of minimum standard, because otherwise, while that's helpful if you happen to be operating in that particular jurisdiction, and that's great, it doesn't help you anywhere else, right? And nobody else is going to follow those laws just because. To your point about being both the instrument, I guess, we are the instrument of the application of sanctions. That makes people upset. When we start talking about acts of war, I want to know how many of you guys would consider an act of war individually if you can't access your bank account, because people get really mad when they can't get their money, right? And so, trying to figure out how to bring that together and look across multiple boundaries, multiple jurisdictions, multiple laws, in an area where we often are used as a victim, because if some adversary can bring down the financial sector, that makes a very strong point for them, right? It is very public, it affects the economy, it makes every headline of every publication around the world. So, the challenge is that we do, to some extent, have a little bit of a bullseye on our back for that. We are globally interconnected, where we're touching in areas, and you think of third-party risk in a traditional sense, we think of it maybe as a country that may not be as cyber prepared or cyber ready as others, where that is the point where they might come into the financial sector from, as opposed to going into a NATO country or the United States. And it's just, the global nature really complicates that. We got Russia who's going off the grid and doing their own thing. We have different laws in every different country that, where people are, these laws, you're breaking the law in one country if you're complying with the law in another country. So the exponential complexity of that creates an absolute great ability for bad guys to go in and take advantage of that, because they leverage these idiosyncratic things like manipulating the prices of a press release of an IPO and trading on information that is actually really legitimate because it went out into the media. And so, we're not thinking about it in the context of necessarily just risk across one entity. It has to be looked at from a systemic level and from a global level. And if you start with, I'd argue that's probably the most complex level. And we've done a really good job, I think, of building from the bottom up, but we're not doing a very good job of getting all of the industries together and all of the countries together, even with the bad guys in the room, because, guess what? Stuff's flying in and out of those countries. How do we bring them together and at least come up with some, minimum rules of engagement?
Oh, real tough fact, right? So,
That's why I'm in banking now.
Yeah, all right, yeah. We better, when you put that chip card in, it better speed up some cash, right? Otherwise it's war out there, right? Gets you thinking. I think the same situation with hospitals, right? What we saw was like, it was an unintended consequence, but it could have been an act of war if you put a missile in or something, you take people out. So, getting to the bigger picture and systemic side, I think I'll get to Rod in terms of, you have seen ICANN and the bigger systemic infrastructure that are out there, right? What can we share with this group and in general is, what would we call an act of war? Just segregating a country out of the internet infrastructure, or a country choosing to self-exclude in this just to defend themselves, right? Two ways of looking at it, right? What Russia is doing versus what China is doing. Right?
It's an interesting chess match over time. But I think so. For one thing, you do have a little bit more, you have resilience. And you do need to have resilience because the cyber wars could happen. So, and I went to DoD, I mean, obviously I work with DoD pretty closely. The 2 cyber centers reported to me. I work for DoD. And I went and I said, look guys, we need to have a failover for the traditional DNS. Because in most of the world, by the way, the domain name system, 95% is running on one version of software called Bind. It's great software. Paul Vixie wrote it. It's a friend of mine. It's amazing stuff. Well, Bind falls over, bad news. And in 2011, there was a packet of death that showed up. One 512-byte packet sent to a DNS server would break it. Not shut it down, break it. So it had to be reinstalled from scratch. And this stuff sits in there for decades. People don't touch these things.
And I don't think too many people even understand the ones that are making the policies go to that level, right? So I think that's where you have to bridge the gap.
Yep. Anyway, so and I probably went too deep there, but I think the Russians there's a resilience objective. They want to reduce that last mad, or be dependent, but be able to operate independently if they need to. But I think they want to force.
Chad has a comment.
Yeah, I think Rod's really on it. By the way, I haven't heard you say that, Rod, but I really like that framework, mad. And I think that the issue around dependencies and disruption, it's a true story that Siobhan remembers this, when the United States was under a massive DDoS attack against our financial institutions. It was contemplated that we would take offensive retribution, and it is reported, I was not in the room, but I know somebody was, that then Secretary Geithner said, can anyone in this room assure me that if we do this, that if they retaliate back, that we won't have a vulnerability in our own financial system. And the room apparently went dead silent. Yeah. And that's what killed it. And so I think Rod's got his finger on the right issue. This issue, when I talk about retribution, I'm passionate about it, but I recognize it is hard. It's not, I don't want to in any way downplay how difficult it is, because I think Rod's point is one of the complexities, which is we're all vulnerable, and we could in fact, unlike a situation where you think you know what you're going to be up against, you may not. So how do you handle that? I'll throw this back to Jacques, is that when I was at DHS, we have a thing called EMACs, Emergency Mutual Assistance Compacts, and they're all between different states. So that in our country, if my home state of Texas is being under a devastating, overwhelming natural disaster, it can invoke an EMAC with surrounding states, and they will send aid to help out. Like in a hurricane, they'll send their utility trucks. This happens, and it's become a routine in the United States. We now are working on a cyber EMAC in our country, but what NATO is, if you think about it, it's an EMAC, right? It's all the NATO nations come together, and if need be, under Article 5 self-defense. So, on this issue of vulnerability, Jacques, do you think, right now you represent, arguably, I think, the most out front, advanced concept of an international EMAC? Is it, and you're not speaking, we recognize you're not speaking for NATO right now, but on your own personal view, do you think that a cyber EMAC concept could be expanded so that if someone takes a collective response and they get attacked and are vulnerable, there could be additional resources and support to back them up?
Are you aware of the European Union cyber emergency response teams?
It's like a CERT, EU CERT?
Yeah, well, maybe I said the wrong acronym. Anyway, yeah, it's not, it's basically European Union program, and I'm lacking the right acronym right now, but with lead nations establishing teams that are mobile and ready to go assist a nation that's under attack. NATO, I'm scanning my memory now, so far NATO nations, to my best knowledge, are responsible for their own networks, and the NATO CERT is responsible for NATO networks, which there are not that many views, so it's the national step first. And there is the Cyber Pledge program, where nations take a pledge of actually invest into their own cybersecurity. All what it is an extension of or reminding nations of the Article 3 of the Washington Treaty, which seems that many nations have forgotten about. When President Trump is asking nations to invest into their defense, he's only talking about, hey, 1949, you signed the treaty, Article 3 says that you do the utmost to defend your own nation first. So it is the commitment that we've taken. So in NATO, in cyber, we're currently, to my knowledge, is you take care of your own networks.
Yeah, understand. So we'll take a final observation from Siobhan. We'll start with you and go around.
Yeah, I think the question I would leave you with is, on attribution and on offensive operations, to what end? The question is, it would have to be so catastrophic to actually have a behavioral impact. I know we've done a lot of stuff with China, but has it changed their behavior? Not really. So how do we get to a point where we can do something about these bad actors that actually has an effect on them in such a way that their behavior changes? Because that's effectively the end game we're trying to get to, and we're trying to do that on a global scale. So I think that's kind of what we need to really think about.
Right. Chad, your final thoughts?
Just to echo Siobhan and the rest of this really impressive panel, I would say we need retribution, and it needs to be public and clear. And the next time we get an opportunity, what we call the teachable moment, like WannaCry, for God's sake, seize it. And it doesn't mean that we have to offensively attack them with cyber. We could slap massive sanctions. We could go, but make it a much more public and a much more painful consequence.
You did this, we did this back.
That's right. Public.
Public. All right. Jack, and then close it out.
I want to take us 100 years back with my Air Force past. 1920, in the military operations, everybody was talking about the new domain, air power. The discussion was, should we have separate air force? Some nations established separate air force. What's the doctrinal, tactical use of air power? Will air power win all the future wars on its own? What's the moral, ethical, legal, boundaries of using air power? So basically, 100 years later, we're talking about the very same things, just in the domain is new.
Learn from the past. Learn from the past. Rod, your final thoughts?
Yeah, finally, it is a mad cyber world. And the last simple thing to leave us with is that there are two key superpowers in this game. It's U.S. and China. And the two of us, working together, have to figure out how to stabilize this global system. We have differences. There's real problems with the IP drain, but we've got to work this thing out. And that's a big chunk of what my own life is committed to, contributing to, but it takes all of us at all levels.
What a phenomenal panel. Great topic. So we take a 15-minute break and we come back. Thank you so much.
Panel photo.
Oh, yes. Panel photo.
Panel photo, that's right. Let's do it. Need my posse of boys.
It's good the break was on time.
I think it's the tallest.
No,